Thank you. So yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to come and chat to you all. I really like to get the message out there about environmental forensic science, because it's not always the kind of first thing people think about when it comes to crime science degrees or forensic courses. So hopefully you'll find it interesting and can incorporate it in somewhere if you don't already. But I'm having issues as well. So just a little bit about me, in case you don't know me already. I'm a senior lecturer at Liverpool John Moores University in forensic bioscience, and I've been here since 2017. I am a module leader for a final year forensic bioscience module, and for all intents and purposes, it's almost a forensic ecology module. It's a module that's interested in the interactions and relationships between various organisms, whether or not that's an individual who might be deceased, and the surrounding environment, microorganisms that we can find there. So it's very ecology based, very environmental based as a module. My teaching portfolio is within forensic ecology typically, and also within trace evidence, and also the use of microscopy techniques. And I do this kind of teaching across undergraduate and postgraduate programs. And I'm also developing some PhD work with students in these areas as well. And because of my interest in forensic ecology, because the environment is so accessible to me, I'm trying to stay as research active as I possibly can. And I work within primarily forensic diatom analysis, which is a kind of microalgae in freshwater crime scene investigation. But I also have some experience with pollen and soil analysis in terrestrial crime scene investigations as well. And interestingly, I know everybody comes to forensic science from a different kind of pathway, and that's what's so interesting and so engaging about our discipline. And my academic journey actually started out in geography. I did an undergraduate geography degree from 2008, and I think if you'd have asked me then if I ever envisaged that I would become a lecturer in forensic biology, it would have been very low down on the list. But I'm here, and it's all because of my interest in, obviously, the application of geography and the environmental sciences within forensic investigations. So before I tell you a little bit more about my teaching and the kind of assessment approaches that I take, I just wanted to kind of introduce you all to environmental forensic science if you're not aware of it already. If we define our environment, we define it in two ways. The first are our surroundings and conditions, and these can be anything. We have multiple environments that we visit on a daily basis. And environments are a key, obviously, part of crime. Like a crime happens in and around different environments every day. So the environment is not something new to forensic science. But what I'm particularly interested in is the environment in terms of the natural world. So I'm interested in the kind of grass, the soil, the plants, the water, and how those kind of repositories can provide forensic evidence, link people with particular crime scenes and so on. And the value of the natural environment, the natural world, comes from the tremendous amount of variability that's within it. So at a very basic level, if we look at soil, it's brown, it's mud, it's not very exciting. But soils are really, really variable depending on lots of different factors. So if we can analyse soils and look at those micro features in a bit more detail, we can actually start to characterise, we can start to discriminate, and we can start to identify differences or similarities between forensic samples. And it's an area of forensics, an area of variability that not many people know about, those committing crimes and so on. So this variability is obviously super, super important to us forensically. Obviously, the natural environment is pivotal to our existence, and we interact with the environment very regularly for food, for transportation, for recreation and well-being. But we also interact with the environment during crime events as well. So the natural world often provides a clandestine location to dispose of any evidence or to dispose of an individual that might have been the victim of a crime. It can provide areas where accidental death might occur, where people might hide from investigators and so on. So the natural world is really, really important to us forensically. And this is just to highlight some of the kind of variability in terms of our natural environments. We tend to think about these kinds of crime scenes as being remote in terms of being inaccessible, where somebody can hide something or try and ensure that something goes undetected. But we also encounter natural environments on our domestic areas too. So gardens, for example, we could look at environmental traces from somebody's garden to try and identify burglary suspects or offenders. We can look at city parks. We can look at canals versus rivers versus reservoirs versus lakes. Even inner city areas like Liverpool, where there's not much going on in terms of the natural environment, we can identify environmental traces which might link people to particular areas of forensic importance. So this diversity is really important to us, and this variability is really important to forensic investigations. So in terms of what environmental forensic science is, it is essentially the application of natural and the earth sciences to legal investigations. And these natural and earth sciences range from things like geology and geography and biology and ecology to more specialist kind of areas such as botany, even entomology, limnology, and so on. So there's lots and lots of different scientific disciplines that can feed into and can be applied within environmental forensic investigations. And environmental evidence is typically circumstantial, which means that it can help us to answer really important questions to an investigation, including who, what, how, when, and where an event has happened. If we've got multiple crime scenes or multiple scenes of interest, we can identify the authenticity of those. It could be assessing a crime scene location versus an alibi location, for instance. The environment and traces of the environment can help us to identify those kinds of questions. And the goal is obviously to identify relationships between people and scenes of forensic interest. So the scientific discipline of ecology is all about interactions and how we as species interact with each other and interact with other species and so on. And I find it really interesting because we can think about crime as an ecological process. If we think about somebody inflicting harm on somebody else, that's an interaction. If we think about somebody interacting with other species, it could be a wildlife crime event, it could be a decomposition event, and so on. So we have ecology as a really key element, I suppose, to crime as they occur, and also to how we investigate them. And our scenes of interest can obviously be what we call terrestrial scenes, so those scenes that occur on land. They might involve water, they might involve either freshwater or marine ecosystems. They might be in domestic locations versus outdoor locations. So even if we think about in somebody's house, if there's a burglary or an assault in a house, we all have house plants, we all have flowers, potentially cut flowers in our houses. We might have fish tanks, and all of these sources can still provide environmental forensic evidence, which is interesting. And then also we've got the rural and urban environments to think about as well. And I'm quite particular, I suppose, in terms of terminology in forensic science and trying to be inclusive in terms of what we can incorporate within an individual discipline. And environmental forensic science is nothing new. It's been around and it's been discussed quite heavily since the 1950s amongst a group of people that have been interested in it. I think the first application of soil analysis in forensics was in 1904. Similarly, analysis of plant traces in the 1930s and so on. But what I think is really interesting is to think about the different terms that we can use to describe and to encompass environmental forensic science. So forensic geology was the kind of first term ever used to group these kinds of analyses in forensics and their application. And to me, geology implies a kind of study of rocks. It implies the study of inorganic materials. So it kind of then broadened out a little bit to forensic geoscience, which again is still quite physical, quite inorganic, non-biological. But then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got forensic ecology discussed as a subdiscipline, which is more biologically focused. We've got environmental forensics defined. I think there's an actual journal for environmental forensics, but it's all about crimes against the environment or contamination and so on and so forth. So I don't think there's ever been a term to incorporate all the different aspects of the environment that might be useful to us before. So I tend to use the terminology for environmental forensic science to encompass the kind of inorganic, the organic, the soil, the terrestrial zones, the aquatic zones, and so on. And obviously the applications can be quite diverse. There are different approaches that we can take within environmental forensic science, which can answer some different questions. So we can use biological approaches. We can look at different organisms within the environment and identify any interesting things that they might tell us. So a good example would be the plant communities present at a crime scene. Every plant type has different characteristics. So from the leaf patterns, from the growth stages, down to the microscopic detail of the pollen. So if we recover somebody and we suspect them of being involved at a crime scene, we could potentially look at the pollen or the plant traces on their clothing or in footwear and try and link them with that environment. There might be tens, if not hundreds of different plant species in a particular place at a particular time. We can use chemical approaches. We can use water chemistry or soil chemistry to assess incidences of waste disposal, which contaminate the environment. And we can also use physical approaches, so using geophysical techniques, for example, to search below the surface for clandestine burials, to try and recover human remains which might have been hidden for many, many years. So there's lots of approaches and lots of scientific disciplines that feed into environmental forensic science. And something else that's important within our discipline is the kind of scale and the diversity of the approaches that we can take. So right at the very small, the microscopic level, we can get quite a lot of information from microorganisms which are present within the environment. And these might often be recovered as trace evidence, or they might be analysed in terms of trying to develop a molecular clock for decomposition and so on. And these are micro traces involve obviously like soil bacteria, soil eukaryotes, might involve slightly larger microorganisms that we can analyse microscopically, diatoms, pollen, soil mineral grains, and so on. We've then got larger organisms which might provide macroscopic evidence that we can see. So if we apprehend a suspect, we might find soil on their shoes, we might find soil on a shovel, we might find plant traces on their clothing, and so on. We then have scenes of interest. So if we do identify a clandestine grave, for example, the soil in and around that grave could provide really useful forensic evidence, either primarily there at the scene or later on if we do have a suspect that we suspect has been involved in a criminal offence. Whole landscapes are important as well. So if we're searching for a victim of a crime, then that is particularly important. So we have lots of techniques that we might not think about necessarily as environmental, but that we can apply within environmental forensic science. So drones, sonar to search underwater and so on have a really key role to play within environmental forensics. And networks are obviously also really important. So trying to identify the origin of drug shipments, for example, the origin of trafficked people or trafficked goods is really important. And it's also important to mention that there's lots of relationships and interactions that occur at these different microscopic and macroscopic levels. So what we find in one area can also impact what we find in terms of something else. So one key example here is that when we have a clandestine grave, for example, we have a victim buried in a shallow grave, they will leach nutrients out into the environment, and this will encourage the growth of new plant species. And if we can detect those differences in the plant species, then we can potentially detect unknown grave sites. So that's just one area of where we have these interactions and so on. In terms of forensic application, we can apply environmental approaches in search and recovery, as mentioned, either above surface or below the surface. We can use environmental microtraces to estimate the cause and time since death. So stomach contents analysis, for example, we might find plant fragments associated with diet. We can use algae to understand the cause of death by drowning. We can use environmental traces, microorganisms, as a form of trace evidence following transfer and persistence onto recipient surfaces. And we can also use them to reconstruct location. So locations are often really important in a forensic event. A lot of the time, there's suspicion that a missing person might have come to severe harm, but if we don't have a body, it's very difficult to prove that. So there are lots of cases out there where soil evidence has been examined to try and find where somebody might have disposed of an individual and so on. And we can also use it in product authenticity. So determining whether artwork is real or a forgery based on any pollen that might be underneath during the painting process, to identify where drugs have been grown or have been shipped from. And we can also apply them within environmental crime. So looking at things like illegal waste disposal, contamination in the environment, pollution, and so on. So some examples, as I've mentioned earlier, we can use geophysical techniques to look below the surface for anomalies which might be associated with buried remains. There's lots of people doing this. I think Jamie Pringle is a key one in Kiel, and lots of different aspects of the environment can affect how successful those techniques might be. We can also use microtraces. I mentioned algae and diatoms in particular, my favourite things to talk about, but they're a form of microalgae which, if somebody's drowning in water, they'll take in quite a lot of that water, and the water will contain diatoms. And if we identify those internally, they can help us to diagnose death by drowning. And then finally, there's also soil samples attached to footwear, for example, which, as I said, can try and identify an unknown location if we can analyse the different properties of them. So in terms of our teaching approaches within environmental forensics, it's really important that we incorporate our learning, within our teaching, environmental concepts and techniques initially. So before we can start applying them within forensic contexts, we need to understand the importance of the underlying biology or geology or chemistry and so on. So that's a key thing that we have to communicate to our students when we teach environmental forensic science. So, for example, with diatoms and the water, species of diatoms will differ based on the amount of silica within the environment, based on light availability, nutrient availability, and so on. So having that background ecology and background biology there is really important for us to be able to interpret diatom evidence within forensic science. So that's something that we have to kind of get across when we incorporate environmental forensic techniques. And I think what's also really important is that to encompass the kind of range of environmental forensic science areas, that we think about different stages of an investigation and the different forensic processes that might be involved. So from a kind of broad view, when we've got a potentially missing person or we're looking for a victim of a crime, we have the first three kind of stages in terms of search, recovery, and reconstruction. So we're looking across the landscape for any signs of disturbance which might be associated with an individual. If we then find that individual and they're deceased, then we would recover them. And then the final stage is obviously to look for forensic investigation, to look for forensic evidence, in order to reconstruct what kind of crime might have occurred or what has happened beforehand. And within that reconstruction stage, it's obviously important for us to think about these different stages, and these are always incorporated within our teaching of different subdisciplines within environmental forensic science. So evidence collection, analysis, interpretation, and presentation. So in terms of our teaching approaches, what's really useful about the environment in terms of our education is that we can incorporate really dynamic learning environments. We can go from crime scene through to lab, We can incorporate work in the field, as I said, in the lab, and also through kind of scenario-based workshops to try and apply our learning and develop skills in different areas. And that's particularly important within forensic science to think about not only the evidence collection, but also the analysis and interpretation, and they all kind of feed back to one another. So it's really helpful that students can actually see the implications of that. That if you don't collect something properly in the field, then obviously our analysis could be compromised later on, as could our interpretation, and vice versa. In terms of teaching delivery, there's potential to incorporate environmental science within dedicated modules, so almost kind of forensic ecology modules or forensic geoscience modules. And these are the kind of key areas where I tend to be involved from a teaching perspective. I'm aware of a few universities that do offer these kind of dedicated modules, but even if not, there's still the potential to incorporate environmental forensic science within kind of existing modules which might be more popular with students or might be core modules. So things like trace evidence analysis. There's nothing to stop looking at soils, pollen, diatoms and so on within this kind of area. Forensic archaeology and search techniques, forensic biology, genetics, for example. We're seeing new methods to genetically identify these kind of environmental trace materials. Forensic chemistry, soil chemistry can give us lots of useful information, but also through skills modules as well. So I think our students often, they don't want to go outside in the field, especially in January when it's cold and raining outside and everybody's miserable. But it's a really important skill that our students need to learn in terms of crime scene investigation. It's not always inside, in-house. More often than not, it does involve these kinds of outdoor field, outdoor areas. So it's important that fieldwork's incorporated as a key skill. In terms of assessments, we've used things like field exercises before, so outdoor crime scene, monitoring evidence collection, ensuring evidence continuity, documentation and so on in the field, as well as in more suitable indoor locations. We've also done lab reports, so students have to collect data, analyse that data and interpret it. Presentations I've found a really good method, especially with master's students, to try and apply methods learned in the lab to potentially a case scenario and so on. We've had presentations in the past where students have been asked to look at different environmental search techniques, for example, and to try and identify cases where they've been used successfully or not for critical discussion. And then also exam learning as well. We have case interpretation and evaluation. And what's really nice about environmental forensic science is there's a lot of problem solving, a lot of critical thinking, and a lot of scenario-based learning, which accompanies what we do and what we teach. So as an example, we've got a final year forensic biology module, forensic bioscience module, and this is one that I teach to biology, forensic science and forensic anthropology students. The topics are not only environmental, but they do incorporate the environment quite a lot. So even things like decomposition, post-mortem interval estimations, forensic pathology, the environment is a really key aspect of all of those things. So it's discussed quite heavily and integrated quite nicely with our environmental traces. And we use lab practicals, and we do some online scenario-based workshops, which the students really enjoyed. And that's something that came in during COVID, but because they've enjoyed it so much, we've kept it in there for now as a good way of kind of assessing evidence as you might encounter in an actual investigation. And in terms of our assessment, we do a 2,500 word report, which is 50% of the module grade, and that's exploring different factors influencing forensic entomology and burial behaviour of larvae. And then we also have an exam, which has typically been a face-to-face exam, but our university is moving further towards the kind of online assessment after COVID. It's not really going back. And as a result, we're having to deal with AI and trying to make it a little bit more inclusive and a little bit more robust. So I'm currently in the process of changing this assessment from being 50% essay based to 100% kind of interpretation based. So that's going to be based on a case scenario. So based on this evidence that we've given you, tell us if the cause of death was accidental or homicide. And then also using short answer interpretation questions. So based on this data in relation to diatom evidence, for example, tell us what might have happened. An MSc module that we have has covered lots of different topics as well, including environmental evidence alongside other types of trace evidence. This is a heavily practical and applied module, so I think of the teaching hours, only about 9 or 10 of those are lecture hours, and the rest, about 30, are practical hours. And that really feeds into the assessment, which involves the students independently analysing evidence to try and reconstruct a forensic case. So we have suspects, we have background, and the students have to identify who done it, basically, which they always really enjoy. I think within forensic science more broadly, obviously research and casework informed teaching is always really important to try and maintain where possible. And for our students, I think that they learn, they kind of take in the information a little bit when they see how it's applied and how it has been useful in different capacities. So I like to try and incorporate casework examples, especially to see. To kind of demonstrate the value of these techniques that they're learning in the lab and in lectures. And although I'm aware of obviously lots of different case examples, they're becoming more and more aged. There are very few kind of recent examples that are published and that are available to discuss, which I do think could be a potential limitation within the discipline. We also have different student research projects within environmental forensics, which have been developed over the last kind of few years. And these are usually based around my interests, including things like trace evidence dynamics, the transfer and persistence of soil, pollen and diatom evidence. Interestingly, a lot of these studies obviously take place in the lab, but during COVID, we were still able to kind of do these kinds of experiments out in the field by just using new approaches, using different techniques, which I think is a strength. It's a relatively accessible area of forensic research because the natural environment is all around us. Had students doing environmental surveys before, so looking at different areas, marine versus freshwater versus soil, biological communities, for example. We've had studies looking at method development and exploring forensic limitations, so trying to understand potential contaminants that might limit the interpretation of diatoms in drowning cases and so on. So there's a really broad potential for research projects which are applied to different forensic areas, trace evidence, pathology, etc. So to summarise, the natural environment is often encountered in forensic investigations, and it's not just important during an initial search, but through to evidence recovery and analysis, and it's important that our students know that. Integration within forensic science education often varies, so I've been really fortunate to work at universities where this kind of teaching is important. But I realise it's quite a niche area of forensics. It's not always high on the list of things that our students should and might want to learn. The subject offers a diverse range of teaching and assessment approaches, and environmental science is applicable to a range of forensic disciplines. So even if it's just a lecture or a seminar here and there to introduce students to environmental biology or environmental chemistry applied to forensics, then I would obviously encourage that and welcome that if it enhances knowledge and enhances awareness of our subdiscipline. And just a shameless plug, that we currently have 2 funded PhDs within environmental forensic science being advertised at LJMU. So if you're aware of any graduates that might be interested in these, please do pass them on. We're always happy to receive inquiries at least. So thank you very much for your time. I'm sorry if I've gone over, but I'd welcome any questions if you have them.